Well, welcome everyone. I'm Lucy White, a nonprofit strategy and governance consultant at the Osborne Group. Thanks for taking the time to join us. Today, I'd like to introduce session 5, the final of our webinar series, The Fundamentals of a Sustainable Nonprofit. In this series, we've addressed 5 key challenge areas facing nonprofit leaders in light of the pandemic. In our first 3 sessions, we covered the topics of strategy, revenue, and operations. In session 4, we explored virtual retention, including insights into working well and the requirements of our employees to be productive in virtual settings. Today, we dive into governance with specific insights for board members. A quick reminder that video recaps of each of these topics are available on our website and YouTube channel. Our speakers today are Richard Onley and Margaret Bodden, Principal Consultants with the Osborne Group. Richard is a finance, leadership, and board governance expert. His board experience includes Special Olympics, Nipissing University, the Muskoka Conservancy, International Policy Governance Association, and a master's certification in board governance. Margaret is both a practitioner and advisor on board governance issues. She works with boards to set strategy and align board governance to support delivery of strategy. Margaret sits on several nonprofit boards in chair and committee chair roles. She holds the Institute of Corporate Directors, ICDD designation from the Rotman School of Management at the University of Toronto. Now I'll turn it over to Richard to lead us into today's presentation.
Thank you very much. In today's session, we're going to cover off first board policies with Margaret. I will be covering fiduciary responsibilities that you owe to the organization. We'll bring some clarity and definition to that. Finally, Margaret's going to guide us through risk oversight and how we can meet our fiduciary responsibilities. And finally, we'll go to our question and answer period. I'll turn our webinar over to Margaret.
Great. Thanks, Richard. So board governance has an awful lot of topics in it. And today I'm going to focus my discussion on board governing policies. And then later on, I'll come back and talk to you about risk. So many things we could talk about, but that's where we're focusing today. So, and within that, every organization has 3 foundational documents: the bylaws, management's operating policies, and the board governing policies. So for the next few minutes, I'm going to focus on board governing policies. For the board, having strong policies and procedures lays the groundwork for effective board meetings and decisions. Board policies and procedures are entirely separate from the organization's operating policies and procedures. Board policies cover the expectations the board has of itself, essentially how the board will ensure that it has met its fiduciary responsibilities. Ideally, your board will have a governance committee that oversees the board operations. The governance committee functions a bit like an internal compliance operation. It ensures that policies and terms of reference are in place, and if there are questions, clarifies the roles and responsibilities of the board. So board governing policies. So every board is free to determine what policies it needs to reflect its specific circumstances. What you see on the screen here are just ones that you could have. These are very common ones, but you may or may not have all these. You could think of these as the playbook for the board. They establish what is to be expected or not expected and how the board will respond to the situations that arise. I sometimes think of these as the no surprises version of management for the board. A few years ago, the CEO of a company whose board I had recently joined abruptly left. The board pulled out the succession planning policy and went to work. The plan laid out which board members by position, not by name, but by position, were responsible for communications to staff, communications to customers and stakeholders, and when those communications could be sent. We knew who we had to meet with to approve communications and how the interim CEO would be selected and installed. The plan went on to detail the critical communications to staff and stakeholders that the interim CEO would carry out in the first 2 to 5 days. A complete list of documents that had to be signed and authorized for all financial and budget delegations was at the ready. This was an invaluable resource at a very precarious time for two somewhat related reasons. First, the board members were all volunteers with real full-time jobs. They didn't have extra time on their hands to go back to the beginning and figure out a plan for dealing with all of a sudden not having a CEO. And secondly, having a well-documented and board-approved plan allowed the board chair to hand over the execution of the plan to the interim CEO as soon as that person was identified. And as it turns out, that person was me. And I was very grateful to have the plan to get me started. After a rushed transition, I had confidence that I was doing what the board wanted me to do in the first few days. The clarity and consistency of the plan gave staff confidence that the board and the interim CEO knew what they were doing. The change in leadership was unexpected, but the transition to new leadership was exactly what was planned. I highly recommend having a detailed succession plan as part of the board policy manual. The board will have a method for responding to events that arise, and stakeholders will know what to expect and not expect from the board. Another one, in-camera meetings. In-camera meetings can be a source of dialogue, perhaps controversy for many boards. What should be discussed in the open and what should be discussed behind closed doors? Is it acceptable for the board to vote on a matter when in camera, or do they come out of in camera to vote so that there is a public record of how people voted? So all these things can be documented in your board policy manual, and then you're free to change it in the future, but at least you have those standards in place. So having that clear approved policy makes it a really useful tool for the board. It provides the board with a well thought out board approved process for handling sensitive issues. And this takes the onus off an individual to come up with an acceptable plan for handling a specific issue. So it's board approved. It's not just one person having to come up with that. So policies aren't set in stone, but they must be agreed to and approved by the board. The approved policy should include the frequency that the policy will be reviewed. So every year, every 2 years, maybe every 3 years, and it should actually be in the policy to say, we're going to review it every so often. And I'm going to come back to that point a little further on in my discussion. Okay, so you might ask, how can a board carry out its fiduciary responsibility and manage its own governance? There isn't enough time. So every board should have a work plan to keep it on track and make sure nothing falls through the cracks. And so you might have said, oh, well, how do we develop all these policies and have them in place? Well, and make sure that we review them. They can go into the work plan. So I recently set up a work plan for a board I sit on. For this board, it's critical that things happen in a certain order and in a certain way. Compliance is a big concern. So for the first few months, the board struggled with the time required to review the work plan. And although I was using a tried and true template, this board preferred things to be organized in a way that's more meaningful for them. So together we made adjustments to the format of the work plan, and people's comfort with the structure grew. And I'm happy to report that after some persistence, the work plan has been fully embraced and is seen as a critical tool for success. So your work plan should identify critical board activities and their required timing. And like a Gantt chart, you can identify key precursor activities and include them in the work plan. An example of this might be that the Finance Committee has met with the auditor and completed the year-end financial statements prior to the annual general meeting. The work plan should keep track of how the activities are related to board responsibilities. So is this a strategic planning activity or a financial oversight responsibility? This is one of the ways boards can avoid going down a rabbit hole that duplicates management's responsibilities. And that's a really key key skill to have for a board is, where do we draw the line between what the board is responsible for and what management is responsible for? And I think board conflicts often come out of the blurring of that line. So a work plan that clearly identifies what activities you're going to undertake, and whether they're within the strategic plan or risk oversight or board policies, as you see on this particular slide, can be a really helpful tool for managing against that line of delineation. So Richard, could I ask you to take over and fill us in on the board's fiduciary responsibilities?
Margaret, that would be a distinct pleasure. Good afternoon. Serving on a not-for-profit board is really an honor, and it's an excellent way to contribute back to your community. As a board member, you have a wide range of responsibilities to navigate. In addition to setting strategic direction, monitoring financial health, you really do need to understand your organizational bylaws. Depending where you're incorporated, either federally or provincially, you'll have to be aware of your provincial or federal not-for-profit acts. And finally, you do need to keep on side with CRA, and I think particularly with the objects that CRA approved for those of you who have a charitable registration. I recently worked with a client who's applying for a pretty significant government grant. And as we reviewed the material, we figured this falls outside of our approved objects, and that would have disqualified the whole process. Good news is you can change your objects. You can modify them really at any time. CRA will even help you in that process. So right now, a summary, I'd say, of a fiduciary responsibility and fiduciary duty is to use the collective wisdom of the board to direct and protect the organization while you're ensuring what should get done does get done. Your role here is to direct the operation and the organization, not to operate it. Let me give you a strict definition of a fiduciary. A fiduciary is a person who acts on behalf of another person or organization, putting their interest ahead of their own with a duty to preserve good faith and trust. What this really means is you are legally bound and ethically bound to act in your organization's best interests. And really at its core, being a fiduciary is an obligation of loyalty, of honesty, and good faith. You may not be aware, but when it comes to not-for-profit organizations, your fiduciary role has some heightened duties of care. So let's take a look at the duties of a fiduciary. Your duties can be principally divided into two branches. First branch, duty of loyalty. Second branch, duty of care. Let's take a look first at duty of loyalty. A duty of loyalty means that as a director, you must act with honesty and in good faith in what is reasonably considered to be the best interests of the organization. Here's a case in point. I sat on the board for Nipissing University. Now, university boards are famous for having a wide range of stakeholders. Our board was no different. We had over 25 board members. That included faculty, students, staff, union representatives, alumni, and the mayor. Now, some people believe that their job was to represent their interests of their constituents. This is not your job. As a board member, your job is to be loyal to the organization and work together in a collective wisdom to advance the interests of the organization. You're not there to advance a particular interest. You're not there to advance a particular philosophy. From a practical point of view, being loyal means that you're truthful in dealing with the organization and others, that you have a full dedication to advancing the corporate mission, and you place the interests of your organization above your own interests, and you always, always place the interests of your organization above any other organization. I really believe these points are so important that if you're unable to do that, you do need to leave the board. Now, the second part of your fiduciary duty is the duty of care. Now, duty of care has three elements. You have a duty of skill or competence. You have a duty of diligence. And as I mentioned, you have a duty of special care when you're with a not-for-profit. Really, in a broad sense, the duty of care requires that you act with a certain level of competence or skill and a duty of diligence to meet a standard of care. Now, the challenge is, how do we determine the standard of care? Well, for not-for-profit organizations, we can take a look at court decisions. We have corporation acts, which impose additional duties on directors. And we also have specific charitable law, particularly Ontario's new Not-for-Profit Corporations Act, which has kind of been languishing for about 10 years. But the government has said that they intend to have this passed by the end of the year. Let's just take a look at what the courts have to say. The Supreme Court has ruled that a fiduciary duty is relevant to the assessment of the standard of behavior that should be reasonably expected of a director. And they also insert a warning here when they're giving this opinion. They say this standard will most likely come into play where a board or individual director is sued for alleged negligence. Ouch. Let's see what the federal and provincial not-for-profit acts say. Now, the one-time charities were governed by the Business Corporation Acts. Now, if you're incorporated in Ontario, you'll soon have to conduct your affairs under the Ontario Not-for-Profit Act or Not-for-Profit Corporations Act. If you're federally incorporated, you conduct your affairs under the Canada Not-for-Profit Corporations Act. Now, when it comes to fiduciary duties, both the Ontario and federal link up. They both tell us that you're required to act honestly and in good faith with a view of the best interests of the corporation, that you exercise reasonable care, diligence, and a skill that a reasonably prudent person would exercise in comparable circumstances. So let's bring this all back then to the first element in the duty of care. When we look at the first element, the duty of skill or competence, as we've seen, the court says the standard is what should be reasonably expected. The legislation adds discussion about being reasonable and prudent. The challenge here is that, these are pretty subjective standards, but if we summarize them up, they require you to exercise a degree of skill and diligence that would amount to the reasonable care that an ordinary person might be expected to take under similar circumstances. So you don't need to perform your duties with a greater skill than would be expected from another person with the same knowledge in the same circumstance. What it means is that reasonable care can actually vary from director to director. So, for example, a lawyer might be held to a higher standard than somebody who's not a lawyer. Now, this doesn't entirely let you off the hook. It doesn't let us blame the lawyers for any problem, but the common law generally holds that a director cannot be held for errors in business judgment. So that's added on to this. It also, common law says that we're justified in entrusting certain matters to the officers of the corporation, and in the absence of grounds of suspicion, we're justified in trusting that our officers will perform their duties with honesty. So if we really sum this up, what does it really mean? It means your decisions really have to be based on all the available material and, when required, advice from professionals. You're responsible to oversee all aspects of the organization. Now, you can delegate certain functions, but you must maintain a supervisory role. Really, in other words, you have your hands on the organization, keep your fingers out of the pie. Now, the duty of diligence, number 2, means that you must attend all meetings and become fully informed, really on most aspects of the organization, and particularly significant issues that the board's dealing with. So it means that you have a responsibility to ensure you have all relevant financial information. You have to review the board materials. You have to do this well ahead of the meeting. I've been on some boards where you can just pick it up. They've reviewed the material a few minutes before. That really reflects in performance. Finally, you have to exercise independent judgment. You can't necessarily go with the flow, all the time. You clearly have to support a final board decision. But when you're having those discussions, you need to be independent. Really, at the end of the day, you have to be fully informed if you're going to meet your oversight responsibilities. I was recently asked to join the board for a significant not-for-profit organization. So I attended an online meeting, and they were reviewing the financial results. And one of the board members, who was a CPA, started to ask some in-depth questions. And I thought these were all quite reasonable questions. I was really quite surprised, I'd say even shocked, when she was told by the vice president of finance that, well, these questions are really getting into the weeds. And as I scanned on my screen, I could see different heads moving up and down in agreement. I want you to think about this. If this organization were to fail and the board was to get sued, what do you think a judge would say about getting into the weeds? Remember, the judge or the board is in charge of the organization, and the CEO is its only employee. And really, a board member has the absolute right and authority to ask for any amount of information needed to satisfy a legitimate question. Going into the weeds is not an excuse. Now, our third element in exercising duty of care has a special meaning for not-for-profit organizations. And, this was an area I was never really quite aware of. But, when you're a director of a not-for-profit organization, you not only have to meet the general standard of care we've discussed, but you may be required to meet some higher standards. And the reason for this is that as a director of a not-for-profit, you're generally seen as being entrusted to care for property that's subject to either a direct or an implicit trust. For example, think about specific terms that donors or other funders place on condition when they're providing funds. You're, as a director, responsible to ensure that those funds are spent according to the donor's wishes. And depending on the circumstance, this is where you start to get into a trustee standard. You know, we've all seen the sad news about Laurentian University declaring bankruptcy. I have a number of friends there. It was reported that the university had exhausted the general bank accounts and had been forced to start using some of the restricted funds. In fact, they eventually exhausted the restricted funds and got to a point where they couldn't meet a payroll. Now, it appears that the board claims that they were unaware of the deteriorating financial situation, which good reporting would have pretty much made obvious. The auditor never sounded any alarms. And you got to think, would there have been a different outcome if some of the board members had decided to get into the weeds and ask some relevant questions? You know, there's a court case that really does speak to trustees' duties and responsibilities, and also to the personal liability when you don't take an active role in administering the trust. And this absolutely applies to not-for-profits. In this case, I'll call her Trustee 1, had signed a resolution offering and authorizing Trustee 2 to manage a group of trust funds with their absolute discretion. Years after signing the document, Trustee 1 had made no inquiries about the funds, not a word. You know, the sad thing was that during this time, the trust lost a significant part of its value. So when it came to the court decision, Trustee 1 was found liable for all the losses because in the court's view, Trustee 1 had abdicated her duties entirely and had improperly delegated the powers to Trustee 2. The court went so far as to say that she had abdicated her duties entirely and that her conduct amounted to willful neglect. And that's pretty harsh language in court terms. So trustee number 1 was ordered to reimburse the trust for almost $500,000. Now, the main lesson here is that you are responsible to oversee all aspects of the operations. You know, you can and you need to delegate certain functions and responsibilities, but it's maintaining that supervisory role. You know, you have to ask yourself, how can you supervise and understand all aspects of the operations? And, you know, the reality is no one person can do this, but you can accomplish this when you've got the proper tools. And Margaret's going to show us what those tools are. Margaret, I'll turn it over to you.
Okay, well, excuse me. Thank you, Richard. So yes, as a board, you know, you have to ask yourself when, you know, one of the tools that we think about is risk management for looking at fiduciary responsibility and, you know, are you handling those risks? Richard gave the example of Laurentian and the other organization. And so, you know, clearly there were some things that they weren't thinking about. So you might ask yourself, well, you know, what can we do about that? So risk oversight, you have to say, you know, as a board, are you comfortable that the risks of the organization currently faces or could face in the future have been surfaced? And I like this particular graphic because what it's showing is, you know, you're sitting there in the sun on the right-hand side of the screen and everything looks wonderful. But on the left-hand side, you know, the storm is rolling in and you maybe don't see it. You know, the little houses there, the little buildings, they're under the blue sky. So, you know, it does kind of seem like, oh my gosh, it's being very negative, but you can also just be prepared. And that is part of your fiduciary responsibility. So risk oversight, though, doesn't mean every risk needs to be considered, nor does it mean that the board is managing the risk. The board's role is to ensure that management is effectively managing the risk across the organization. And this oversight could include the identification of interconnected risks within the organization, which, particularly in these pandemic times, there are newly emerging risks and rapidly evolving situations that pose challenges to ongoing operations. And high-performing boards are putting strategy and risk discussions on the agenda at every board meeting. Including these topics at every meeting gives the board an opportunity to have a deeper conversation and gain a deeper understanding of the concerns. Some boards will review the risk register once a year, and that's certainly sufficient. But including risk oversight at every meeting is helpful as it breaks up the discussion into manageable chunks while keeping risk oversight on the board front burner. Risk management plans should be consistent with the organization's strategic plan and be rolled out to employees and other stakeholders so that they appreciate the organization's efforts to manage risk without impeding operations. So let's have a quick look at what a risk register might look like as a tool that the board would use. So first of all, this risk register tool is a joint responsibility of management and the board. So this is where you're walking right along that line of who's responsible for what. The board is responsible for the risk oversight. The management is responsible for the tool itself. So, and they're also responsible, the management is also responsible for executing against the risk register. So the board will be responsible for managing the ongoing oversight of the tool and ensuring that the elements on the risk register are current and sufficient to meet the needs of the business. So particularly in times like these, when things are changing rapidly, it's really valuable for a board to be looking at this at every meeting and saying, yep, you know what, we've got all the critical things on here and we're comfortable with the key mitigation activities. So many organizations use a risk register to do exactly this. They're working together to agree on the key organizational risks, the likelihood of each one occurring, and the potential impact on the organization. And this sets the organization's risk priorities. So there are many potential risks out there, but some are more critical than others and should be prioritized. And that's what this will help you do, is decide, so which ones are the real focus, because you could be managing everything and the management will be managing all the risks. But from a board point of view, you just want to focus on the most critical ones. And so getting agreement between the board and management, what those will be, understanding that, what's having agreement on what the likelihood of something happening is and whether it's a high, medium, or low impact if it does happen, is a really helpful way of identifying your risk priorities. So I'm going to wrap it up there and we can move to the Q&A. And I think there's been some robust activity on the Q&A portion of this webinar. So David, do you want to step in here?
Sure, yeah. I think you saw the first question, Margie. But we had someone asking about in-camera meeting and the expression specifically. He's curious and apparently hasn't seen it before, so I was hoping you could elaborate a bit.
Okay, so yes, maybe I should have had a definition at the beginning of what an in-camera meeting is. So I did, and the question was specifically, never heard of this in French. So I went to my preferred translation site, Lingui, and they call it la séance à huis clos. And if you go to Google, it's a réunion à huis clos. So it does exist in French. And so an in-camera meeting is where the board actually takes a motion to move in camera, and management generally leaves. It's only the board. So there are no observers, there is no management, and the board uses this to discuss sensitive issues. And some boards will decide that they can pass a motion in camera. So there's there isn't a record of who voted how if you have recorded votes. And then other boards will say, well, you can have the discussion in camera, but you need to actually have a motion to move out of camera and have a recorded vote afterwards. So hopefully that helps you out with that.
Great. So we have a bit of a two-parter here from Paul. He asks, can you recommend a good board policy manual template for a smaller not-for-profit to get started? And then he asks the second part saying, do you lean more towards a less detailed prescriptive governance policy format or a more detailed policy with less room for interpretation?
Okay, thanks for the questions, Paul. So board policy templates, you know, I have some that I like to work with, but they're just starting points. You can find templates online, you know, anywhere. One of my sources, one of my best sources for things like this, when I've been doing more legal documents, is you can go to publicly traded companies. They post a whole lot of stuff. The trick will be customizing it for your purposes. So, you know, I gave the example of the board that I'm on. It's a small board, and I have lots of documents from other boards. So I was using what I called a tried and tested template for a work plan, and it still had to be customized. Even though I've used that template before, you need to customize it for your board. And that's where the real trick is. So you can get templates anywhere. There are non-governmental organizations that post these things. Just recognize that you're going to need to customize it for your board. And you asked the question about how much detail. Not too much detail. It shouldn't, you know, the board policy is a policy. It's not a it's not the manual per se. You know, there may be a manual that somewhere else in the organization on the operational side that says how you're going to do things, but the board policy is just a policy, and it sets effectively the fences for what you're going to do. It might set timelines for, you know, something has to happen within 48 hours of a meeting, or meeting materials need to be issued a week in advance, but that would be the most detailed. It effectively sets the fences around how you're going to manage a particular occurrence should it arise, whether it arises occasionally or on a regular basis.
And, you know, I might add too that, you know, when you're setting policy, you know, that's, you know, defining your relationship with the CEO, I always find it's best to go to a depth that you are comfortable that the CEO is going to interpret properly. And in fact, I sometimes go to the point of asking the CEO, how do you understand the policy? What sort of measure are you going to give us to do this? You're free as a board to set any level of detail. You know, for financial, you could just leave a policy that you're going to avoid financial calamity. There's the policy. You could ask the CEO to interpret it back. You could go into more depth and specify some specific reporting or requirements. You'll set a budget. You'll have quarterly statements. You might even drill down a little further and say in the case of Laurentian, it might have been just a simple enough policy to ensure that the cash reserves match up to the restricted reserves, and that is proved or demonstrated or monitored at each meeting. So I think, yes, as Margie says, you set a general policy, but if you want to go down and get into depth, if you've got a CEO that's maybe new and, you know, doesn't understand, you know, some of the ins and outs, you know, particularly with the startup organization, then you may get into more detail. If you're a seasoned place, you set a general policy and you'd be fine.
Okay, so do you have any ideas as to what might be a good formula for deciding the ideal number of members in a board of directors?
Well, I generally find this. So there were 25 members on the board at the university. It was not workable. I mean, we hardly had enough room around the meeting table to get things discussed. And invariably what happened is you ended up with an executive committee. The executive committee decided everything, and people would just nod their heads. I think what you want to do is have a board, probably up to a dozen people. That gets workable, and that lets people get to know each other, work together as colleagues, and really each board member is fully participating in all aspects. You may set committees to give advice to the board or information to the board, but it's your whole group, the whole board, that then discusses that information to make a decision. So look at what's workable, I think is the key here.
Yeah, and if I can just add to that, I think one of the things that drives board size is the decision whether you're a skills-based board or a representative board. So in my experience, representative boards, which have fallen out of favor, tended to be larger because they had to have one person from each constituency area. So because new constituency areas could pop up because somebody would say, oh, but we're different, we're special, right? So we need our own representative. So that was, I think that's one of the things that made boards very big. Boards are moving to skills-based boards, so it's more thoughtful about what skills do we need and how many people do we need to serve that purpose. And that has been part of the move to have boards that are more, as Richard said, about a dozen people.
Thanks, Margie, David, and Richard for this really useful presentation. I've made a note of some of my takeaways, such as how the elements of governance all fit together, how a board work plan can help keep a board on track, and the role of a risk register, which I had always found good in theory, but in practice was not very effective. And Margie's example, I think, was really, really helpful. I especially appreciate deepening my understanding of the duty of care, which seems to be a perennial problem for many boards. And we had some more discussion about that, which was also really helpful. Thank you again for joining us today. As you think more about what you learned, I would encourage you to also visit us at osbornegroup.com for more details on the full series and the many insights that have been shared. The reference you want is to look under our Insights tab. Video recordings are also posted to our YouTube channel for your reference, and I know David will send out the link for that in a follow-up email. Richard and Margie have been kind enough to lend their time for a complimentary follow-up offer where they will answer any questions or concerns that you may have. We'll send you more details by email on how to take advantage of this offer. As we wrap up this webinar series, we know that the transition back to normal will continue to present you with and your organization with unfamiliar challenges. I hope you found some useful lessons to help you sustain your organization. For now, thanks again for joining us, and we hope to connect again soon. Have a great week.
Bye-bye.
Bye, everybody.